Minnesota's professional athletes are using their voices and their influence to help drive the conversation about racism in all parts of our society. WCCO's Norman Seawright joins us now to talk about one of those conversations. And Norman, I was just sort of enthralled yesterday by your talk with all different types of athletes there from each of the different sports. How did that all come about? Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, Heather, we decided here in the newsroom that we wanted to have a conversation like this. We wanted to get all the professional athletes involved because we saw what they were doing on social media, just talking about what they were seeing, what they were feeling, what they were hoping was going to come about. And we had an amazing conversation with all four of the athletes you see there. There's Ja'Cory Hayes from Minnesota United, Anthony Harris from the Minnesota Vikings, Defiza Collier from the Minnesota Lynx, and Matt Dumba from the Minnesota Wild. And Dumba himself said that when we talk about race with white, non-white people, the conversations can be tough. They can be illuminating. They can be uncomfortable, emotional even, but they ultimately do bring everyone together.
I've had some awesome conversations just through the last couple of weeks. Conversations that aren't the most comfortable either. A lot with my white friends who are still learning, and they're reading all this. It's super cool to have these and come together and have a sense of understanding that I don't think we've ever had. And is terrible that a tragedy of this magnitude was the inevitable boiling point for all this injustice and police brutality. But to see people willing to change and listen and just give that attention to the subject has been really cool. And I think we all can agree on this, that change isn't comfortable. So these conversations are tough, and they give you chills. And even thinking back to them right now, like I had one of my best friends, we never talked about anything of this sort of race, of what's going on in the States or how it's different than living in Canada. And he kind of just poured his heart out to me, and it finished with like hugs and tears. And I'm better friends with that man now.
Wow. He's an amazing person in general, as many of us know, as well. But some of the stuff that he said in your story from before, just the racism that he felt in a very white sport, hockey.
Right. Yeah, and the fact that he mentioned no one really could tell what his ethnicity was, so they threw everything at him to see what would stick. He said that. Yeah. And I believe he does have some Filipino ancestry. So to see the way that he puts himself on this platform to say, I'm standing with everyone on this and trying to help educate everyone on this topic, I think is commendable. Not everyone has that level of understanding to go through that. Really, they don't. No,
and to have those conversations, those really hard conversations with your best friends, and end up with you both crying, it's really powerful.
It is, and you have the conversations, but then you have to get to a point where you do something about it. Right. And Minnesota United's Ja'Cory Hayes essentially said, talk is cheap. We have to be sure that we make this an ongoing conversation, make this an ongoing discussion, an ongoing effort and a crusade, rather than just let it be a flash in the pan.
I would be echoing what everyone else is saying, just trying to commend people that have reached out and, they've had those conversations with their parents or their relatives, trying to do what they can to put some action in their lives. And that's kind of the biggest thing that I've been trying to communicate with people is not letting it just all die once this conversation or once this kind of initial phase or social media outbursts, and there's a lot of media attention to it now. Like once that's all done, where are we at? Like, are we going to revert back to life was a couple weeks ago, or are we still going to be taking baby steps and making little micro actions to lead to some sort of change? So it's I've been trying to stress that in the conversations, whatever actions that look like, whether it's passing stuff on social media and educating various people, your various followers, what it looks like, going out to protest. It might look like this conversation we're having here, being on a podcast. It could look like, volunteering at a school. It takes various forms, but finding out what actions that you need to take so this doesn't just die off in a couple weeks. This is something that we need to revisit again in 6 months. This is something that we need to, you know, have a checkup on in a year time. Like, what progress have we made since a year since George Floyd's death?
Yeah, and that's something that we've just heard so much over the past couple of weeks is just keep going, keep pushing this conversation.
Yeah, and I asked all four of them, you know, their experiences with racism, and I think anybody who has, you know, who grows up not being white has experienced it in some way. I mean, I tell you all the time, I get the "you're so articulate" comments. This happens a lot. Hayes says, you know, he grew up knowing that he had to work twice as hard to get anywhere around half as much recognition for the things he was accomplishing, Heather. And when it comes to trying to make your way in a society like that, I mean, Anthony Harris said it too, you know, you worry that you are being perceived as a threat. You know, when you walk down the street, someone might clutch their purse a little bit harder. And you understand these things when you grow up of color in a society like this.
One of the things that was interesting to me is each of these athletes were talking about their families and the discussions that they had had with their parents, to the point that you are making, and having these conversations with their parents because they knew it was hard.
Yeah, and Nafisa Collier even touched on that point. You know, her family is mixed. You know, her father black, her mother white, and she has to have these conversations with her mother's side of the family that the things that they do, that they say, are intolerant, they're closed-minded, and that she has to make them understand how they affect them.
Nafisa's story was especially hard to listen to. I mean, the racism that she faces early as kindergarten, and how she handled it with grace. But I just, you know, she's amazing. She's incredible, and we're happy to have her in Minnesota.
We are, and so they're trying to keep this conversation going. And as I said, Anthony Harris tries to reach as many people as he can with content on social media, mostly positive stuff, trying to get people to relate to injustice and the black experience to help further open this conversation, help people be educated.
I try to really just point out instances where, you know, for somebody who may not really understand what it is they're watching in one scenario, I try to give them multiple ways to understand or show different examples of inequality in situations. Just because, you know, if you get one example, but you don't quite understand it, then you may not actually feel like there's inequality going on in the video, or because you've never experienced or, you know, felt that particular, you know, stereotype, because you may be a, you know, a white American man in today's society. I try to point out different situations where maybe it's not about race, but just how would you feel in this situation as a human being? I feel like some situations are easy or a little bit easier to point out, but I always try to trigger who's ever watching, or the viewer who's watching, to just look at it from a perspective of, you know, not black and white, but how would you feel if this was you? Or how would you feel if that was your nephew or your mom or your uncle in that situation? Because I think the more we can create, you know, that connection and be more relatable to one another, it's when we're really going to spark and get that person to engage and actually want to, you know, partake in becoming an advocate for, you know, police brutality, or whether that's racial inequality, and simply just become part of the change, even though they aren't directly affected by it.
Norman, this feels different. I mean, obviously Anthony Harris being very vocal on social media. In the past, we've seen obviously Colin Kaepernick that athletes be punished for speaking out and speaking up. But this feels very different. This conversation is so authentic and so real, and you can feel some of the pain in their voice.
You could. And the reason for this, and all four of them sort of touched on this point, was that this one felt like a tipping point. What happened with George Floyd felt like it brought everything to a head. I mean, there were a number of instances over the past week leading up to that. And we were also, you know, we didn't have the distraction of sports. We didn't have anything to take us away from this is the reality in America. And for them to speak up, and for their platforms, their clubs, their franchise teams to be behind them on this, it is very different.
Right. All right. Norman Seawright, hey, thanks so much for being here today and for sharing their stories. We really appreciate it.